Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming this afternoon. My name is Christopher Riopelle. I am the Curator of Post 1800 paintings here at the National Gallery and the co-curator of the exhibition currently on downstairs, Delacroix and the Rise of Modern Art. It is an exhibition that the National Gallery has organized in collaboration with the Minneapolis Institute of Art. And my co-curator there is Patrick Noon, a great expert on the Romantic period in both French and British art. My part of the division of labors, if you will, if Patrick looked at Delacroix and his contemporaries, I was particularly interested in looking at the second half of the title and the rise of modern art, particularly what happened to Delacroix's fame, to his renown after his death in 1863 and for the next 50 years. And that is what I will be talking about a little this afternoon. I must thank our education department for putting together a really excellent lecture series in conjunction with the exhibition, which I think has allowed all of us to look at many, many angles, aspects, facets of Delacroix and his influence week by week. And I would very much recommend that you come back this time next week, when it is our very great privilege to have as our speaker Dominique de Fonréau. Dominique, a curator at the Musée du Louvre and the director, actually, of the Musée Delacroix in Paris. The Musée Delacroix, also a national museum, and as it were, an appendage of the Louvre, but one of the most enchanting ones. And Dominique, who knows so much about Delacroix as a person, as a personality, as a figure in Paris in the first half of the 19th century, will have many fascinating things to tell us. You see the man himself on the screen in the famous self-portrait of 1837 in the Louvre, a man of great stature, bearing a certain hauteur, even as he stares with great confidence out at us. He is 39 years of age at this point, in having been born in 1798, and having been a world-famous artist, really from 1822, when he made his first appearance at the Paris Salon, showing at that time his tumultuous picture of the bark of Dante. It made him famous overnight, as these things often happen, and throughout his life he was, if you will, one of the sights of Paris, one of the great figures to be seen, and someone whom one could always be confident that year after year at the Paris Salon or elsewhere, he was going to present pictures of great provocation. He was going to challenge the limits of what art, what painting in particular, could be. He was, interestingly, largely self-taught in the sense that he was interested really only in painting, and in that sense, interested only in color. He wanted to use color. He wanted to see what he could do with bold and vivid color, and he did not want, as was in fact part of the French academic tradition, he did not want to spend 5 years making rather quiet and safe drawings after plaster casts. He wanted to get right out there painting from the beginning, and so for lack of other training, he taught himself. And that certainly, and we will see aspects of it here, that certainly was one of the provocations of his career, that right from the beginning he was postulating that you could do it without having recourse to the structures of the state, how the French state thought you ought to go about becoming an artist. And certainly that was one of the aspects that other generations of younger artists would very much respond to. Now, after long illnesses, though he wasn't old, he was only 65, Delacroix died in August of 1863. He died in his house, now the Musée Delacroix, in the Place du Faubourg in Paris. But it was in August, and then as now, it was difficult to get a crowd together in Paris in August, in this case for his funeral. So his funeral in Père Lachaise Cemetery was a very understated thing. And right from that moment, certain people, young artists and critics, thought that he deserved more, thought that his contribution should be acknowledged much more publicly. And three of the people whom you see in this picture, Henri Fantin-Latour, painter, Édouard Manet, painter and the leader of the young generation, if you will, and Charles Baudelaire, the great poet and critic and champion of Delacroix. The three of them, in the days following the funeral, decided that something major had to be done in time for the Salon of 1864, the following May. And it was determined, after much back and forth, much discussion, that Fantin-Latour would paint a large-scale, bold painting as an homage to Delacroix. And this is the painting that he did many preparatory studies, but finally settled on this painting, showing a portrait of Delacroix in the center, a portrait that may have been derived from a photograph by Cowl rather than from a painted portrait. It has the look of a photograph, although oddly at that time no photograph could possibly have been of this size. So it's negotiating a rather ambiguous territory. But gathered around the photograph are a group of the portrait are a group of young artists and critics there to express their admiration for Delacroix and to say that it was he who was leading them, the young artists of Paris, into the future. I've pointed out the three, but it is intriguing that he should be the two most prominent figures absolutely flanking the portrait are, as we see, Édouard Manet on this side, and on this side, James McNeill Whistler. Whistler himself beginning in certain ways almost to look like Delacroix with his great mop of curly hair, and indeed who would go on himself to have a famous personality, to be a big figure in both London and Paris in the way that Delacroix had been before him. Other artists and critics are gathered around, Le Gros, the critic Duranty, etc., some of whom, interestingly, had never met Delacroix, were not, unlike Baudelaire or Manet, were not friends with him, could not say that they had shared thoughts, ideas, dinners with the master. Nonetheless, were anxious to be there to state how important he was for their careers. So here you have, in the spring of 1864, artists who themselves were, for the most part, not yet famous, but were recognized as the young Turks of the art world, pledging their allegiance to this man who had recently died. Now, the painting, as I say, was by Fantin-Latour, who in that same year, 1864, showed a second painting at the Salon. So you can imagine these two pictures side by side. And this is the second one from now in Los Angeles, scene from Tannhäuser, Venusberg. It is the most erotic scene from Wagner's opera. Wagner himself had been in Paris only a few years earlier, had conducted Tannhäuser in Paris, and night after night had almost been booed out of the theater by a claque of very, very conservative music lovers from the Jockey Club, for the most part, who wanted to destroy Wagner's reputation in Paris. Of course, all the young people, all the young artists were for Wagner. And so you can begin to see the kind of strategy that Fantin-Latour, one of the leaders of the young generation of artists, was making in that spring of 1864. He's showing one painting dedicated to Delacroix, recently dead, and a second painting dedicated to a kind of homage to Wagner. And so he is positioning himself and his friends at that point. We, the young artists, these are the people we admire. We know you don't admire them, but this is where we are staking our claim. It was a highly strategic positioning for the young artists, right at the point when government support was fading away. They would have to carry on independently, and Fantin was, as it were, striking a blow for that independence. Now, those of you who've seen the exhibition will know that it is structured largely around a series of comparisons of works by Delacroix with works by the artists who would follow, in a way, one by one, to identify the various ways in which the young generation, and they were never consistent over the next 50 years, took up this aspect or that aspect or another aspect of Delacroix's art to push their own forward. We're looking at a reduced replica of what was the most controversial painting in Delacroix's entire career, his Death of Sardanapalus, a work he showed, a very, very large-scale work you may know now in the Louvre, that he showed at the Salon of 1827, which was widely condemned by the official art establishment. It actually derives the theme from a Byron poem, Sardanapalus, an Assyrian emperor, his city under attack, in flames. You see it at upper right. Decides that if he is to go down, then everything he owns, all his treasures, his harem, his horses, his jewels, his everything he owns, his slaves, will die in a great bloodbath around him. And that, with Sardanapalus presiding at the center, is what you see here, one of the harem being murdered in front of us. Not only that, not only is the subject matter chaotic, violent, threatening even, but so too, in a way, is the manner in which it is painted, with these extraordinarily strong contrasts of color, the blood red of the sheets that gets picked up here and there across the canvas, the livid flesh tones, the violence that keeps erupting, and indeed the precariousness of the composition is as if we're looking at that bed at a very dangerous angle, as if Sardanapalus would slip off on it. And this was certainly taken up by the critics for and against, that it was not only an image of chaos, but chaotic in the way in which it was presented. Indeed, Delacroix was called before the Ministry of Fine Arts and told in no uncertain terms that if he carried on in this way, he could expect no support from the government whatsoever. Delacroix had a very, very difficult time selling this picture. He didn't manage to do so until 1844, when he sold it to actually an Englishman, a man named Wilson, who finally was persuaded to buy it, and knowing that he would lose this most important evidence of him, his art at its most controversial, Delacroix painted for himself this reduced version of the picture now in Philadelphia, and he always kept it with him all his life. More than that, he accentuated all of the things, all of those aspects of it that had been criticized in 1827. He carried them even further. The reds are even redder. The flesh tones are even more shot with colors. The violence is even greater, as if he were thumbing his nose even more at the establishment in Paris at the time. And so there's something deeply personal about this image that we have in the exhibition. Now, this seems quite a jump. This is Paul Cezanne in the late 1870s. Very ambitious in his art, wanting to do allegorical pictures on big subjects, big themes. Here he takes a very big one, indeed, the eternal feminine, womankind who holds all of mankind in her thrall, driving all of mankind, bishops, priests, soldiers, wrestlers, artists, into a frenzy around her as they wish for her attention. And it was the observation, the sudden recognition on the part of the great French scholar of Cezanne, Françoise Cachin, in the mid-1990s, that in fact this picture of the eternal feminine, in order to paint it, Cezanne had gone and, as it were, transposed the Sardanapalus. The eternal feminine is in the position that Sardanapalus is in that painting. The frenzy around him is replicated by the frenzy around her. Trying to do something big, Cezanne, must go back to the model of Delacroix. And indeed, I think it's obvious from the self-portraits of that we know of Delacroix, that Cezanne has painted Delacroix as the artist who is capturing this scene. So this is one of the first and most important ways in which Delacroix's ambition is carried on to the next generation. That is, he shows young artists like Cezanne how to do very audacious, very, if you will, even over-the-top things based on what he had done decades earlier. Similarly, this is a recent rediscovery, a work that came to light about 5 years ago when it turned up in Spain. It is an oil study for the ceiling of the Louvre that finally in the 1850s Delacroix was commissioned to paint, Apollo slaying the python. It is an oil sketch. It is highly undetailed. That is, Delacroix has very, very much oiled down the oil paint so that he's using it almost like watercolor. He's using it in order to paint very, very quickly, very, very thinly, just lay in the principal forms, the most important colors, allow the picture to evoke the subject rather than to describe it. And we will see over and over again the importance of Delacroix's realization that detail was not particularly important in his art. Evocation was all. And certainly, again, among his followers at the end of the century, Odilon Redon, over and over again, and we'll see other examples, goes back to the model of Delacroix, but now in the interests of symbolism, of evoking magical worlds beyond the ordinary. Similarly, here you see one of the examples from the exhibition itself. On the left is Delacroix's famous Christ on the Sea of Galilee, the ship being tossed on the stormy waters, but Christ placid, leaning back, almost sleeping, unconcerned with the storm raging around that's terrifying his companions. A picture, quite specifically this picture from the Metropolitan, which we know that Van Gogh would see later on in the 1880s and tremendously admire. But even later, you see Redon again doing that same thing, taking the essence of a Delacroix composition, in this the red boat, but even further removing all the narrative elements, just allowing it to be a kind of pure symbol, but a symbol, the boat on the rock, on the roiling sea, but a symbol that still has some of the power that Delacroix had investigated. Now, one aspect, and you saw it in his self-portrait at the beginning where he is dressed very, very soberly, one important aspect of Delacroix's art, and his life indeed, was his Anglophilia. For the generation after Waterloo of French artists, writers, critics, dandies, the example of England and English taste was paramount. Everyone as Baudelaire would say, everyone dressed like undertakers. In fact, in 1825, Delacroix, so fascinated by everything English, Shakespeare and Byron, in literature, Turner and Constable in painting, certain English political freedom, certain ideas of elegance, that he came here. He traveled very little in his life, really only twice outside of France. 1825, he comes to London. 1832, as we'll see, he travels to Morocco. He may be the first great French artist never to go to Italy. But he comes here in 1825, tries to see Turner, is not able to do so. Turner is traveling, but does meet Sir Thomas Lawrence. Visits Lawrence in his studio, sees Lawrence's portraits of elegant English aristocrats or powerful people, and immediately goes back and paints our famous picture that you know, this portrait of his friend, the Baron Schwitter, but very much decked out as an English gentleman in his black suit, his ridiculous thinness, etc. And this painting, even more than Lawrence's pictures, came to be a model for images of aristocratic comportment on the English model right through the century. And in the exhibition, we could have done many comparisons with the Baron Schwitter. We did it with our own picture of our trustee, Lord Ribblesdale, for a very specific reason that I'll come to. But you see, even Whistler being very drawn to that model. And then even into the 20th century, Edvard Munch, the Norwegian, painting the German aesthete, Count Harry Kessler, very much derived again from that model. But this is important. The Ribblesdale is important because at a certain point, the Baron Schwitter came to be owned by Edgar Degas. Degas, in fact, placed it on an easel at the entrance to his studio. So every artist coming to visit Degas, and many did, would see this right away. And so it acquired greater fame than you might imagine as the kind of model of elegant portraiture. Sargent was one of those people at the turn of the century very often visiting Degas. He would have seen the picture, and certainly the Ribblesdale portrait owes a lot to it. What perhaps ties it even more closely is that Sargent, who almost always showed his major portraits first at the RA or other London venues, in this case with the Ribblesdale, chose to show it in Paris before he showed it in London in 1903. I suspect, because he knew that his Paris artist friends would recognize exactly where it was coming from, the allegiance he was pledging to a certain notion of Delacroix's art. Now, I mentioned that in 1832, this great event happens in Delacroix's life. He is invited to join a diplomatic mission to Morocco, led by the Comte de Mornay, a grand aristocrat, a friend of his. It was at the beginning of the French imperialist adventure, if you can call it that, in North Africa that had begun in Algeria with the takeover of Algeria in 1830. Now attention was turning to Morocco. And the Comte de Mornay led a French ambassadorial mission there that lasted 6 months. None of these two-day hops, which makes up diplomacy today. They were there for 6 months. Delacroix himself did not have any real diplomatic function. He was just trailing along after the Comte de Mornay, but it allowed him to see many, many things he otherwise would not have seen. Now, he painted no pictures during that 6 months. He made hundreds, if not thousands, of drawings, hundreds, if not thousands, of watercolors, but no paintings. All of the paintings that he subsequently did of North African themes come after the trip itself, were done back in Paris, and even many years after. He continued to return to the themes he had seen in North Africa throughout the rest of his life. One of the most famous of those is this Women of Algiers in their apartment, a fantasy picture. He would not, almost certainly he would not have had access to any sort of place like this. A harem would have been very closed off to him. Nonetheless, working up now in 1847, 49, 15 years after he had been there, he imagines this image of the exotic North African environment in this great picture now in Montpellier, showing the women in the harem. It is a picture that we know in our theme is very important for our theme of the influence that Delacroix had, because this extraordinary figure you can't see so well, though you can see, and I thank our lighters in the exhibition, you can really, I've never seen it looking so well lit, see this extraordinary tall figure on the right. And we know, for example, that Cezanne saw it because Cezanne copies that figure. But more important, in 1888, Gauguin and Van Gogh, together working in Arles in the south of France, in the so-called Studio of the South, Gauguin and Van Gogh get on a train and go across the south of France to Montpellier so they can see this picture. And they study it with great intensity, and indeed in a letter Delacroix writes, my discussions about Delacroix with Gauguin were electric. So you can imagine these two young artists very much searching for a way forward, and we'll see where it would lead, looking up this artist, Delacroix, and particularly fascinated by his images of North Africa. One of the most extraordinary of those images, and one of the great treasures of the Minneapolis Institute of Art, our collaborators on this exhibition, is this extraordinary picture already 5 years after he was in North Africa, the Convulsionaries of Tangiers. It is a Sufi religious rite in which the Sufi men in a state of great passion pour through the streets of the city. Again, Delacroix would only have been able to glimpse this. He certainly would not have gone out into the streets as this religious festival was going on. So you can imagine him only gathering glimpses of it through shutters, etc. But then 5 years later, being able to remember it with such power, and to, at the same time as he's remembering it, he's editing it down to very strong, brilliant contrasts of color, the whites, the reds, the greens, the yellow, and making it even that much more intense than it must have been in reality. And again, over and over, the artists are looking to how he did this, the almost magical gift he had for doing this as a way forward for their own art. Certainly one of the artists who was most intrigued by him in this was Pierre Auguste Renoir. Here you see Renoir at the top in this picture that, alas, can't travel from the National Gallery of Art in Washington, painting an exotic figure, this long before he himself had ever been to North Africa, very much in the Delacroix mode, reclining woman, like one of those women from the Algiers picture by Delacroix, and then painting a pendant to it, this extraordinary picture that we own from the National Gallery, this woman sort of lying in the mud. It's a very odd juxtaposition. My personal opinion of these two pictures is that in this picture, Renoir is showing that he can do a Delacroix. In this picture, Renoir is showing that he can do a Courbet. And so he's a little bit using the juxtaposition of these two pictures to show off one exotic and glorious, the other very earthy, very realistic. But Renoir, almost from the beginning, as soon as he meets this man, a man named Victor Choquet, a collector of Delacroix, Choquet tells Renoir something that will be very powerful for him. He tells Renoir that he is the new Delacroix, that he understands color in the same way that Delacroix had done, and it was his task to carry on from Delacroix. And Choquet, who was kind of a madman, but was very intense, had a tremendous effect on Renoir. Here you have Renoir painting the portrait of Choquet, and he puts him against an oil sketch by Delacroix from Choquet's collection. The oil sketch almost serving as a kind of halo around his head, making that triple link, Renoir, Choquet, Delacroix, that would be so important to them. And indeed, in 1875, Renoir is commissioned to paint a copy of one of Delacroix's most famous picture, The Jewish Wedding in Morocco, same size as the original, very, very faithful, although the touch, when you examine it downstairs, the touch, as opposed to the big, bold, slashing brushstrokes of Delacroix, is always with Renoir much more minute and fidgety and nervous in a way Delacroix never was. And yet it is, in its way, a great homage to him. Finally, in 1881, having imagined what North Africa must be like through the eyes of Delacroix, finally in 1881, Renoir himself is able to go there. Early in 1881, he goes to Algeria and paints, now, as I say, with the image of Delacroix in his mind, paints some of his most audacious pictures, most audacious landscapes that's kind of allow him to, one of his great breakthroughs, you see, and I'm very pleased that in the exhibition we're actually able to juxtapose the Delacroix convulsionaires of Tangiers with the picture on the right, Renoir's Arab Festival, a similarly chaotic, open-ended, wild and noisy picture, entirely indebted to the example of Delacroix some 30 years or some 40 years earlier. Now, one of the most important Delacroix in the National Gallery is our Ovid among the Scythians. This painting of 1859, Delacroix is older and rather ill by this point, and this in fact would be the last picture he ever submitted to the Paris Salon after a long career that had begun in 1822. It is a picture that met with some hostility there. Well, I should say by general consensus, the 1859 Salon was the most boring of all time. People realized that something was going, French art was stagnant, painting wasn't going anywhere. There had to be a revolution. And indeed, it was brewing in the following decade. But this picture in particular was subject to very conflicting assessments. Baudelaire declared it to be a great renewal of the genius of Delacroix, opening up the work of his later years. Many others, on the other hand, were deeply perplexed by the lack of scale in it. That here you have tiny Ovid in exile being fed milk, about to be fed milk from this gigantic mare. About 3 times bigger than any horse could be. And there was great anxiety about this lack of control of scale, and also about the way in which there seemed no rhyme or reason, really, to the way the figures are sort of plotted around this landscape. For some of the critics, it appeared to be very arbitrary. And the critic Duranty, for example, in contradistinction to Baudelaire, said it's clearly over for Delacroix, it's done. Nonetheless, we know that other artists were extremely interested by what they saw there. We know that among them was Degas, a very young man at that time of great ambition, wanting to paint big subjects on important big pictures on important subjects from antiquity. We know that he made a very detailed copy in pen and ink in one of his sketchbooks of the Ovid painting. And then a very few pages later, he makes his very first sketch for this picture, the Spartan youths, an even more obscure subject than Ovid among the Scythians. This comes from a story in Xenophon that the Spartan girls were particularly brazen and would even taunt and take on the Spartan boys. It is a picture that Degas kept all his life. I think the conjunction of the drawing of the Delacroix with the first sketch for this shows that they were somehow in Degas' mind at the same time. And he also begins at about the same moment to paint this picture, Alexander and Bucephalus. Alexander the Great as a boy with the wildest, most beautiful horse, Bucephalus, whom no one can tame. Alexander realizes if it turns the horse's head away from the sun, and he can't see its shadow, it's not going to be so skittish. And he does so, he tames Bucephalus, he becomes his famous horse. But it is that gesture of turning the head away that is the subject of the picture. And if we go back for a moment, you notice that the head of the mare in this picture is the exact reverse of the head in the Degas, which I think is, in a sense, Degas telling us this is where it comes from. I'm beginning my composition by thinking about what Delacroix did. And indeed, Degas would remain throughout his long life very loyal to Degas. As you know, he formed a huge and extremely important collection of modern and contemporary art. The Baron Schwitter portrait was in it. But of all of the artists in his collection, he had more works by Delacroix than by any other artist, by a factor of 3 to 1, I think. Now, in about 1848, we'll go on to this because this exactly dates 1848, Delacroix leaves Paris because he's very much opposed to the French Revolution that had broken out that year, and he goes to his summer home at Champs-Rosés, where he has a big house, big garden that he is cultivating, and there, for no apparent reason except Julian Bell, in a wonderful essay in the London Review of Books about the show, says he paints these pictures with no subjects in order to express his anxiety at not having a subject, which I think was a wonderful, wonderful way of phrasing. All of a sudden, he starts painting these very large pictures of fruits and flowers. And you can think of flower painting, the most dainty, the most delicate, the most refined, dare I say it, even the most bloodless school of painting. Always safe, always polite. And here, all of a sudden, Delacroix, in the autumn of 1848, is exploding it, is renewing it as a possibility for avant-garde painting, reconsidering it as something full of ambition. And you begin to see, right from 1849, when he shows this and another work in the Salon, a revolution in the painting of fruits and flowers in this way. Suddenly it becomes something, and will remain something throughout the century, that avant-garde artists do. One, to test themselves, their boldness with color, etc. And two, certainly to show off. And we look at that in the exhibition. There you see Renoir and Gauguin, two artists indebted to Delacroix, doing the same thing. Gauguin, indeed, now in Tahiti, he's still thinking about the example of Delacroix. Or, most extraordinarily in our exhibition, this work by Vincent van Gogh, a painting of 1886, which is the year he arrived in Paris. His brother Theo, who lived in Paris, had written to him and told him as he was coming, you know, all the young artists in Paris are interested in two things. They're interested in Delacroix and they're interested in color. And as you know, all of Van Gogh's early paintings are brown. They are almost completely without color of any kind. In fact, this painting is painted over one of those brown pictures, a picture of wrestlers. He's turned it at 90 degrees and started to paint these flowers. And it is as if a veil has been lifted from his eyes. Through the example of Delacroix and of all the other young artists who were imitating him, the veil has been lifted. He's discovering color for the first time and is going kind of mad with the excitement of it. It is, I dare say, not a very good painting, but it is a painting of such energy, of such a sense of discovery at that moment that it is very exciting in the context. Now, I said the Salon of 1859 generally regarded as extremely boring and a sense that something had to be done. Well, as we get into the 1860s, of course, the young Impressionists are coming together. They would be primarily landscape painters. They would be looking for their way forward. Delacroix dies in 1863. He decrees that the entire contents of his studios be sold in order to pay off his debts, in order to give benefactions to his favorite servants, family, friends, that sort of thing. And that sale takes place in February of 64, when suddenly thousands of works by the artist are on the market. Even the poorest Paris painter can afford 35 or 40 francs to buy a Delacroix drawing, or if they're lucky, maybe a watercolor. And one of the most, and we know that they did, and one of the most extraordinary discoveries of that 1864 sale was that Delacroix was a very passionate painter of landscapes. He almost never showed them. They were very much private works for him. And here, all of a sudden, was evidence of how Delacroix would have treated the theme that the young Impressionists were so hard working, trying to understand. Here you have this glorious, free sketch of the landscape near Delacroix's summer house, one of those works that were seen for the first time in 1864. And there are a number of examples in the exhibition to show the influence. But we have this one in particular from a private collection in Minnesota by Cezanne, this river landscape. And there is, in fact, an early photograph of this painting with an annotation on the back of it by Cezanne's son that says, "Copie de Delacroix." Well, we don't know if it is a copy of an actual Delacroix, but the fact that his son, intimately aware of what his father was thinking, would have wanted to make a connection with Delacroix suggests the impact right then and for the 20 or so years after of that discovery of Delacroix, the landscape painter. And we have the very funny painting of this in the exhibition, the apotheosis of Delacroix. But I just show you because it's you may also have a chance to see it it's in the British Museum. The pencil and watercolor drawing for the same picture, the apotheosis of Delacroix. There he is, stark naked, being assumed into heaven like some kind of Baroque saint, while gathered around him here are for the most part, the painters of landscape, the Impressionist landscape painters. This is actually Choquet, the collector we saw. This is Renoir. This with the funny hat is Cezanne himself. And over here, Monet and Pissarro, all of them supplicating the idea of Delacroix as he's lofted abroad. And particularly what they're adoring is Delacroix, the landscape painter, because they're all out there painting in the open air when this, as it were, this vision is vouchsafed for them. Nobody was as deeply immersed in Delacroix as Paul Gauguin. In fact, Gauguin thought of himself as kind of channeling Delacroix. He thought they looked alike. He thought their temperaments were alike. He thought that Delacroix looked Peruvian, which of course Gauguin, part of his ancestry was as well, and that they were the two, if you will, archetypal modern artists. This being Gauguin or being Delacroix was what it meant to be an artist in the modern world. And when he traveled to Martinique and then on to Tahiti and the South Seas, Gauguin traveled with images, prints, photographs of works by Delacroix. And in fact, when he's in Martinique in 1887, he paints this still life. But you see up above is this, what I think is a photograph of this work, which had actually been owned by his guardian, a Mr. Arroza, so a picture that Gauguin knew very well. But here he shows Eve, the Eve part of this expulsion from paradise. And I think it is, he's made something of it. Not only does he express his allegiance to Delacroix, but it's as if he's turned it into a symbolic composition of Eve contemplating the fruits of paradise. Let me continue a little bit with Gauguin. He, in particular, was excited by what he saw as the great stride forward in Delacroix's art, the freedom of color from mere description, the ability to use color, as Delacroix did, for expressive purposes, for intensifying emotion in pictures, something that Gauguin was desperate to study. And here the great work were the frescoes or the painted wall paintings in the Church of Saint-Sulpice in Paris, which were open to the public in 1861. And we know that all the artists were thrilled. Here's one of the three paintings in that chapel, Jacob wrestling with the angel, with this wonderful intensity of colors, of contrasting primary and secondary colors, and a strange dreamlike division between the vision of the wrestling and these people passing by down here. It's hard to overestimate the impact of these big pictures on Gauguin and his contemporaries. Certainly, though, we can see it, we can trace it very much in Gauguin's famous attempt to paint the same theme, Jacob wrestling with the angel, the so-called vision after the sermon, or perhaps vision of the sermon, with that same, in opposite directions, division between the realm of reality here and then this visionary realm here. It is pretty close to a quotation from Delacroix. And that would certainly carry on with Gauguin in Tahiti. And I show you one example under the pandanus tree there, in which this scene of some sort of Tahitian ritual, they're carrying the fruit in some kind of procession. The meaning of the picture is now entirely subsumed in the rich colors and decoration, that way in which color hits us in the eye even before we have the slightest idea what the picture is about. On the model of Delacroix, that is what is being communicated. Now, at the same time as Gauguin was painting, and by this point Gauguin was in the South Seas, so he was not, in fact, active on the Paris art scene. He was not at that moment having much influence. Paul Signac, the disciple of Seurat, painter in the pointillist style, tiny dots of complementary colors, Signac was himself discovering Delacroix, but he was doing something else. He was trying, in a funny way, to limit the influence of Delacroix to being only about color, only about the scientific use of color. And in 1898, having been in gestation for quite some time, he published his defense of pointillist painting, and here it is, From Eugène Delacroix to Neo-Impressionism, arguing that Delacroix's scientific use of color, and again, Delacroix would have been very surprised to learn he'd been using color scientifically, his scientific use of color laid the groundwork for what modern painting would be, which was the scientific application of tiny dots of color in works like Signac's Time of Harmony that you see here. That this is, as it were, the inevitable result of the lessons of Delacroix. This is what modernity was going to be. Skipping entirely over the Impressionists, he dismisses the Impressionists, as one tends to do of the immediately preceding generation. Oh, they knew nothing of the scientific use of color. It's all just made up as they go along. We really have to dismiss them, although I think when you look at a glorious picture like Renoir's Skiff and compare it to the rather programmatic work of Signac himself, this kind of relentless laying on of dots of color or squares of color, I think today we would certainly give the advantage to Renoir as being the more inventive painter. Nonetheless, this notion that Delacroix had shown the way to modern painting was taken up by young painters. No one, briefly, more animatedly than Henri Matisse, who, just like Delacroix had 60 years earlier, was desperate to learn how to use color, but felt, as in works on the left, that he was flailing, he didn't know where to go. He reads the treatise by Signac published near the end of the century. He's actually sitting alone on Corsica when he receives a copy and reads it with great attention and thinks he's found the way, and almost immediately he takes up pointillist painting. And does so for 2 or 3 years. We have in the exhibition this great study for his most ambitious pointillist work, Lux, Calme et Volupté. The very title comes from a Baudelaire poem. It is the preparatory study for this work, which he painted for Signac himself. It was the statement of, if you will, of his allegiance to Signac. But indeed, by the time he finished it, he was very sick of working in this. It was much too slow for him. He wanted to use color even more boldly. He didn't feel this was the way for him forward. He had a great break with Signac over this. In fact, they ended up having a fist fight at the after party of the opening of an exhibition. And he went on to his great color breakthroughs. I just show you this work from the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia, where he follows Delacroix to Morocco. He's given up the idea that all of Delacroix can be subsumed by tiny dots of color, and goes to North Africa with the big, bold vision of what Delacroix had done there 80 years earlier, and that is his great breakthrough. Almost at exactly the same time, Vasily Kandinsky, the Russian, getting closer and closer to Paris as he moves west, is writing his great treatise concerning the spiritual in art, saying that modern art will be abstract, it will be based on color and bold color, and finally, that it was Delacroix who showed us the way to break through from mere representation to the bold use of color, and that it is to him, in works like this, which is just on the cusp of abstraction, we can still see a few representational details, but it's just about to go over. It is Kandinsky arguing through that in a completely different way from Signac in his interest in abstraction. It was Delacroix still who would lead us into the world of modern art. And the exhibition, if you've seen it, ends. It's actually the first thing you see and the last thing you see as you leave. The man we started with, Henri Fantin-Latour, the author of the Hommage à Delacroix at the Salon of 1864. Here, near the end of the century, his allegiance to Delacroix has in no way faded throughout his career, and near the end of his own career, he comes back to paint this image of immortality. And what is immortality doing? You can just make out, it's faded in there, but there it is. She is sprinkling roses on the tomb of Delacroix. So that is the final image of the exhibition, tracing the joy in which generation after generation of French artists, for the most part, took in the achievement of Eugène Delacroix. So I thank you.